All of you. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us on this Public Policy Projects webinar as part of our ongoing Global Genomics program, today in collaboration with Variant Bio. We're going to use this session to discuss the important topic of increasing genetic diversity in drug discovery. So please let me introduce myself and our panel of esteemed colleagues. My name is Kate Orvis, and I'm the chair of the Global Genomics program at the Independent Policy Institute Public Policy Projects. This program, now in its fourth year, seeks to explore some of the policy and ethical challenges of bringing the benefits of genomics equitably to the world. At the heart of our work is the issue that whilst genomics has the potential to bring extraordinary healthcare benefits, it will, unless issues pertaining to the lack of diversity in the data set and the wider genomics ecosystem, exacerbate health inequalities. This program does not lead with the science or technology of genomics, there being many other platforms for those discussions, but with the policy and ethical considerations. It's always been established to hear perspectives that are not always heard, and to ensure that a diversity of perspectives is shared, and to provide a means for jurisdictions and organizations at completely different levels of readiness for genomics to share their insights. In reviewing the list of registrants for today, I was delighted to see that we had people registering from 19 jurisdictions, and I'm so grateful to all of you who helped spread the word through your own networks. Now, I'm joined today by Andre Singer of Variant Bio, Dr. Keolu Fox of the University of California, San Diego, and I think I'm right in saying the first native Hawaiian to receive a PhD in genome sciences, Dr. June Fabian from Wits University Donald Gordon Medical Center in South Africa, and Dr. Valerie Lucic of the University of Zurich. Now, each of our panelists has a unique perspective on how to address the challenges with respect to the lack of diversity in genomics globally, and I'm sure that you will all be fascinated to hear what they have to say. So the format of the session will be as follows. Following my introduction, I'm going to hand over to Andre, who will spend a few minutes exploring the core of the theme of this discussion, namely leveraging human genetic diversity to support drug development and precision medicine. Following that, we will hear Keolu's perspectives, and then from June and Valerie. We plan to leave about 20 to 30 minutes for questions from the floor, and many thanks to all of you who have already submitted questions as part of the registration process. We will be picking some of these up. So please, could I ask you to start putting your questions into the chat or the Q&A function, and I will try to pick up as many of those as I can. Now, for those of you who have joined one of the Global Genomics Roundtables before, you will note that this format is slightly different, but please do use the chat function to introduce yourselves and to share any work or details that you think it would be useful for others to receive. My colleague Chris, or maybe Seve, will also share details of PPP's wider work in genomics, which I hope you will find of interest. And so, without further ado, Andre, perhaps I could invite you to start us off by telling us a little bit more about how Variant Bio's approach to genetic diversity can improve and impact drug discovery and development, whilst being right at the forefront of ethical integrity in genomic research. Andre, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Kate, and good morning, afternoon, and evening to everyone here today. It's a privilege to be a part of this discussion with alongside such esteemed panelists. So as Kate mentioned, I support our genomic partnerships and business development initiatives at Variant Bio, and I'll talk a little bit more about our approach to genomic research and also the foundational work in ensuring that we conduct research while focusing on ethical integrity. So we at Variant Bio, we strongly believe that genetic diversity is crucial to precision medicine and in genomic research, specifically in helping uncover novel therapeutic targets and deepen our understanding of human biology. And again, all while prioritizing ethical integrity. So we're confident that by working with populations that are currently underrepresented in genomic research, we can contribute to creating a much more inclusive medical system. So throughout what I'm about to say, I'll try to contextualize with the work at Variant Bio, with the work from some of our esteemed panelists that are with us here today. So starting with Dr. June Fabian, with whom we've actually collaborated in a genetic study in kidney disease in South Africa. Her advocacy for African genomics highlights the importance of inclusion in global health research. And at Variant Bio, we similarly believe that expanding research into underrepresented populations is crucial for global health equity and creating therapies that can benefit a broader range of people. So in terms of our approach, unique approach to genomic research at Variant Bio, I think a lot of us know that while genomic research has advanced and considerably, especially and expanded, especially in the last decades, it has continued to focus predominantly on large cohorts of European ancestry individuals. European ancestry contains just a small fraction of the global genetic diversity, and that means that we're limiting ourselves in the ability to characterize a huge number of variants with potential impact on health. So at Variant Bio, we work with populations that are often underrepresented in global genomic studies, that have a particular genetic architecture and unique health-related traits. So this allows us to identify health-associated variants that are often absent or rare in European ancestry cohorts, but much more common in other global populations, allowing them to be identified also in much smaller cohort sizes. So through our partnerships with academic collaborators, we recruit cohorts that range from a few hundred to a few thousand individuals, from which we can make meaningful genetic discoveries. Economically speaking, the ability to work with smaller cohorts means that we can afford to do deep phenotyping, which involves collecting precise measurements from blood panels, questionnaires, health surveys, and other tests that are administered to research participants. And this would be prohibitively expensive if our cohorts were much larger in size. We also generate multiomics data from these cohorts that support the characterization of molecular traits at large scale. And then by incorporating genome-wide association studies along with other analytical methods such as QTL mapping and colocalization, we can discover novel targets with human genetic validation more efficiently, while also addressing the lack of representation of genetic diversity in research. So as a couple practical examples, we have worked with Dr. Tony Merriman, who is a world leader in gout genetic research from New Zealand, on a study where phenotyping measurements were collected to better characterize manifestations of gout in study participants of Maori and Pacific ancestry. We also work with Dr. Tristan Pascar in the region. He's a gout-focused rheumatologist from France, and the study was focused on health complexities of gout in French Polynesia. So in these studies, important measures such as serum urate were prioritized as included biochemistry phenotypes, and focused questionnaires about gout flares provided detailed medical history phenotyping. So insights like these not only help develop relevant epidemiological findings that we can provide back to the partner communities, but also generate findings that could lead to a novel treatment for gout, for example. Now, as shifting to our ethical approach and our community-centered research focus, I'll talk a little bit more about some of the pillars of that approach. At Variant Bio, we engage deeply with the communities that we work with. We, in fact, prioritize community engagement to ensure that our research is aligned with the needs and values of those populations, and we do so at the outset of the project. And we also go beyond the standard ethical guidelines by integrating financial benefit sharing into every research collaboration. So as highlighted in a recently published paper in Genome Research, this involves working closely with the communities to ensure that they gain tangible benefits from their participation. Then our benefit sharing pledge ensures that partner communities receive both short and long-term benefits. So in the short term, we contribute to funding local health, education, environmental, and cultural initiatives locally. These are elected by the partner communities that we work with, and through the community engagement process that we put in place. And in fact, to date, we've dispersed nearly $1 million through our short-term benefit sharing program across projects that we've implemented globally. As an example, as the result of the study collaborations with Dr. June Fabian and Dr. Michelle Ramsey in South Africa, we implemented our benefit sharing program by disbursing funds to initiatives that were identified as a local priority through community engagement. These projects included buying water tanks for local villages, the renovation of community spaces for children with disabilities and the elderly, and also improvement in school infrastructure across multiple communities. In the long term, once Variant Bio starts generating revenue, we will share 4% of any revenue earned during the year with the groups that participated in research with us. So in the event that Variant Bio is acquired or goes public, we will make a one-time distribution of the net proceeds attributable to 4% of equity value to partner communities. So in addition to those initiatives, our return of results practice ensures that participating communities have access to the findings that emerge from the research, fostering transparency and meaningful engagement. So we dedicate a portion of our study budgets for return of results, which is planned at the outset of the projects, not once it's already complete. And as per our recent commentary published in Cell, this practice really helps and underpins a more equitable biomedical research relationship. And of course, we also emphasize strong data governance policies to protect privacy and autonomy, ensuring that participants' data is used responsibly and transparently. And here's where we contextualize some of our focus with the work of Dr. Keolu Fox, where he emphasizes the ethical importance of indigenous data sovereignty, which is a concept that guides Variant Bio in our focus on community engagement and governance. So as he advocates for, we ensure that communities benefit directly from the research that they are a part of. And finally, our affordable medicines pledge is core to our work. We commit to ensuring that any therapies developed from these discoveries are made affordable to the communities that contributed to research. And here's where we make a link with some of the work of Dr. Lakes, who is here with us today, and her focus on addressing kidney disease inequities resonates with our efforts at Variant Bio to ensure that novel therapies derived from these diverse data sets reach populations with high unmet medical needs. Therefore, our commitment to affordable medicines reflects her emphasis on equitable access to treatment. So in conclusion, I know I've been speaking for quite some time. So at Variant Bio, we really believe that the future of drug discovery lies in genetic diversity, not just for broader representation, but for better science. Our work is driven by a commitment to ethical integrity, scientific rigor, but very importantly, a meaningful collaboration with the communities that we engage. So thank you, Kate, for the opportunity. I'll hand it back to you.
No, thank you, Andre. I think we'll have all heard some really important key themes there. In the absence of Dr. Keolu Fox, just momentarily, June, I wonder if we could come to you. Andre spoke in quite a lot of detail there, just in terms of the importance of community engagement. And I'd be grateful if you would share your perspectives and your thoughts on this. This is an important topic that we talk a lot about at PPP in our Global Genomics program, but I would be delighted to hear your own personal perspectives. June, the floor's yours.
Thank you. So just to give you some background or some perspective, I do my work in a rural community in South Africa, which is defined as a population health and socio-demographic site, which means there are 31 villages that are part of a community that are followed longitudinally. So the importance of community engagement cannot be emphasized enough, because without the community buy-in, none of the projects happen. So there's a dedicated, what we call public engagement team that are employed from the community. And with every single project that gets proposed to be conducted in the community, there's a whole process. And I think what's come out of the work with Variant Bio, aside from the fresh approach of actually recognizing the value of including African populations in genetic research, because I always feel that I'm trying to raise the flag to say include us. And then Variant Bio said, we want to include you. So that was really refreshing. But I think in terms of kidney disease, rural communities are the most disenfranchised. There are genetic variants within African populations that have not been described. Up to 60% of our patients, we don't know why they have kidney disease, and that remains under-researched. So in addition to the underrepresentation, I think what's really important is that funders don't recognize the value of funding research in our communities. 95% of global funding goes to high-income countries. Less than 5% comes to Africa. So in terms of the relevance and how important it is to get traction, can't be understated within this setting. How the community engagement process worked with Professor Ramsey, who had a project with Variant Bio on cardiometabolic risk, and ours was on renal disease in similar communities, is we had to do it up front, which was what Andre was saying. You can't do this after the fact. So, and we have to recognize that it's a process. And by that, it needs whatever it needs for the specific community. So initially, we proposed the projects. We discussed the relevance. There were kind of town hall meetings that we had with various representatives from the communities, and the science was explained, and there was a Q&A on what the relevance would be at individual level versus population level, which is really important for genetic work, how we would convey what we found from the studies, which is becoming more and more relevant because a lot of people want their own results and they want those contextualized for them. And then the concept of a benefit sharing program, which is not the norm for funders. So this was a new thing for Michelle with her Origin project and for me with the kidney disease project. So we kind of had to float it with the community and feel how they felt about it, discuss what it looked like, how it would work. And I think what made me really sad is that the communities didn't believe that it would ever happen. And in one of the meetings that we closed, one of the participants stood up and he said a prayer. And his prayer was that this would come to fruition, that it would actually happen. So I think that kind of left me with realizing the responsibility of how to do this equitably and how to make sure that we delivered on our commitment and that we delivered it in a way that made the community feel heard. And I think that's where perceptions of what communities perceive as valuable versus what I might perceive as valuable is a completely different conversation. And within the community, it's a process. There are dissenting voices. Those voices need to be heard. Consensus needs to happen amongst the community. And I think we need to also be really mindful that that is their process, and communities need to define what they want to do with the benefit share. So in the beginning, it was a little bit easier because the first project with Variant Bio was a smaller amount of money because it was a pilot project. So a percentage of the project went to the community. And then it was about us realizing that you need an infrastructure to enable that to happen. And there are certain requirements from Variant Bio to ensure that it gets done properly. So it was trying to work out the differences between, for example, an urban community where there isn't a tribal council, how that works, versus a very rural community where there is a tribal council, and they are the kind of the top tier of how this whole process gets followed. So I think it was learning for me as a researcher as well. It's about understanding that you can't rush the process. So a funder can't come to us at the end of it and go, this needs to be dispersed within 3 months. It doesn't work. Or otherwise it's not going to get done with appropriate community representation. And then I think what's also important is to try and balance how to do it fairly. So for example, in the 31 villages in the community in which we work, every village had a perception of what was equitable, and that had to get accounted for. So for example, with the water tanks, 2 water tanks went to each village. And the village had their own system. I thought they would be mounted on concrete blocks, and there was a completely different system for how they perceived that that would happen. And we have followed up, and we've only lost 3 out of 66. So yeah, I think it's about being sensitive, being mindful, about communities believing that it will happen. And I think it's a model that requires a dedicated team on the ground to make sure that it gets done the correct way, because it's certainly not easy. I think it's vital, but it does require some thought and a team of people who are willing to take it on. So maybe I should just stop there, and if there are any questions, I'm very happy to.
Thank you, June. I think
take them.
I'm sure lots of people will have many questions. I think that this idea, there not being one size, there's not one answer here. The fact that everything is going to be specific to each individual community, and understanding the power balances within and between communities, really important points. And this idea, I think, is really important, is that we need funding to properly enable community engagement. A lot of discussions, that always seems to come as a bit of an afterthought, or people are supposed to do on their own time for the good of the project. It needs to be properly funded. I think that's a very valid point. Thank you. Valerie, on the basis that, bless Keolu, I don't know what's happened, the diary, maybe it's some issue, then Keolu thought we were starting in an hour. So, I think we'll give him a few more minutes to sort of thoughts. Valerie, if we could come to you now. June mentioned there about this equitable access and ethical kind of engagement. These are issues and themes that we talk about a lot at PPP, and I would be absolutely thrilled to hear your perspectives. Then Keolu, I'll come to you. Get yourself some coffee. Valerie.
So thank you very much. And it's definitely very interesting. And I think it's beautiful to hear how June is going about this so humbly, really putting the community at the heart of the research, which I would echo doesn't seem to be always the practice. So, I think that's really, she's describing sort of the state of the art in a way, which hopefully, people will understand and will take on board. I think from my perspective, I always come at it from the equity, trying to look at it from the equity lens. And again, I also come from South Africa, basically getting, seeing people who do not have access to things that other people do have access to. And so I think it may sometimes come across as being somewhat negative, but I do feel one needs to remind people, because one of my big questions is often which community gets chosen. And so here, obviously, WITS has a very well-established, long-standing, excellent collaboration and, working together with this particular community. And so the people in the community have obviously built up trust. They know that if someone comes along who they recognize and asks them sometimes personal questions, they know from experience it's probably going to go reasonably well. But often there are communities, how do we identify the communities with the biggest questions, the most pressing questions? How do they get to people like Variant Bio and say, we might have a genetic problem, can you help us? So I think a critical thing is that we tend to often over-research certain communities because they are easier, they are accessible. That might be reasonable in certain places if the research question is appropriate. But for example, someone put in the chat as well a question about Latin America, and this is also very much left behind, as is Africa. And you may know there is this epidemic of chronic kidney disease of unknown origin in Central America. It's amongst the top 4 causes of death in the whole country. In Nicaragua, El Salvador, even Mexico, etc., is kidney disease in general. But there's this chronic kidney disease of unknown origin that we still don't know why it's happening. It's an epidemic happening to young men. And those communities are being very much over-researched because lots of global teams are there. And you just wonder, there is a concern that there's too much research happening in certain communities and it's not being done in others. What I think is critical as well is if one really wants to do deep phenotyping, one has to have the phenotype well described. And if you go to places which have weak health systems, you're not going to know if a person has a whole lot of comorbidities, etc., what their family history is, what their parents may have died of, what their brothers and sisters might have, and all of this the family history is critical for genetics. So again, there's going to be big holes, and these might be reasons why certain communities are not approached. So I do feel it's wonderful that you are giving back to the communities and strengthening, but I think one of the questions as well should really be this idea that any research done anywhere strengthens the health system itself, over and above just for the research, so that blood tests might be available, x-rays or other kind of diagnostics are available just in general, that one uses research in a way to try to improve the standard in general for everybody else. Because again, there's also inequities that if you are interested in a certain disease, the people who might be eligible for your study may get certain care, and everyone else in that clinic is not getting that kind of care because they happen not to have, whatever the phenotype was that you were looking for. So again, I just constantly just try to raise these questions, just thinking, especially if you do happen to be coming across a community where you realize that the health system is not strong at baseline, you may still be able to artificially in a silo run your project. I'm saying artificially in terms of, in terms of standards, access to care, etc. But really, I think there should be some sort of an obligation that if one's going to go into a community, one thinks about how do I actually improve the standards in this community. So if someone else wants to research something else, a patient may actually have had a diagnosis that might make them eligible. And I think in terms of ethics as well, there are always questions in terms of ownership of the data, ownership of the genetic data and the biosample. A lot of times they get shipped outside. So the huge question is, strengthening capacity to actually process and analyze these things locally, which not only means machines, but it also means people who can then run them, who can analyze the data, so that ideally as well, there will be capacity building of the researchers, which helps if there become hotspots of various things or interesting clinical questions in a certain environment. Those researchers are trained and well enough, familiar with how to do things that they can then try to start projects on other topics, having gained experience in, a specific research project. So I think these things are for me very critical. The other issue is, coming to a community and saying you're going to get 4% of the equity or whatever. It could be considered coercive, depending on what the community is hoping for. So there are also some ethical questions that one has sometimes. If you offer something in turn, and especially if it's in turn for genetic data and things like that, that people hold very dear, and in some places they feel it's almost their spirit that they're giving you. This question of incentives, I think, is thorny, because I think it's great to give back to the community, absolutely, but how to do that without making any suspicion that the chief of the village might suddenly put pressure on everybody to join the study because they want a water tank, So one really has to think about all of these things. The final thing I think, and then I'll stop as well, is just this idea of therapeutic nihilism. So sometimes people realize they have nothing in their communities. They suddenly think, wow, a study is coming, and then they think all their problems are going to be solved. Clinical problems, medical problems, or they might come to you with something and then expect you to be solving other clinical or medical problems. So I think there again, I'm sure in the community engagement process, this comes out very clearly. This is research, but it's a difficult concept to explain to somebody. People are coming with white coats and with syringes and tubes and all of this that looks exactly like it does in the clinic. And then suddenly you're just taking something away, and you might come back in 3 years to tell me something. So, I think, again, all of this is critical, and these are probably components that are included in your community engagement. But I feel, I just wanted to put out a couple of these things just out of interest, and just from my perspective, I think if we really, really, truly want to think about equity, we should think anybody in the world should be in a position to be considered eligible, which means there has to be something that they are somehow engaged in the system, and that everybody's problems have a similar chance of, you know, being worth researching by these big companies. Thank you.
Thank you, Valerie. I think you raised some extremely important points in there. I think you're right. A lot of these issues are quite thorny. I'm always kind of quite taken in terms of, you know, moving from research, you know, we recognize there's more research that's required, but actually moving it into clinical application. So in England, for example, you know, we have worked hard in terms of having equitable access to the benefits of genomics and the genomic medicine service, but are the benefits of that equally available to all of our populations? Well, the answer is probably not, because we don't know enough about all of our population. If you extrapolate that around the world, that's almost like a microcosm of what we're talking about. So I thought that you raised some really very important points that I'm sure we'll pick up on. So, Keolu, coffee in hand, 1 hour ahead of schedule. We would love to hear, but I am going to have to tell you that we're at 32 minutes past, so I will be indicating when it's time for us to pick up with some questions. But Keolu, thrilled to have you here. Sorry for the confusion. We would love to hear your thoughts, maybe picking up on some of the themes that Valerie and June have raised.
Yes, and good morning and good afternoon, everyone. I think everyone's raised such incredible points. I would point to, I think one thing that's a celebrated success for Variant Bio is just rolling out benefit sharing in its different scales and within different communities. So one thing I noticed, someone on the chat put something, so I don't want to pick on them, but we shouldn't monolith Indigenous people. We're quite diverse, and I'm from Hawaii. And within Polynesia, we have a totally different experience with colonialism. Even within Polynesia, you know, in New Zealand or Aotearoa there, you know, colonial overlord is England, whereas Hawaii, it's America. In French Polynesia, it's France. And so there's this dynamic difference in this prism in which you have to design solutions. We have different healthcare systems. We have so there's so many different layers of complexity in terms of engaging people and then helping them feel whole in terms of the assets you give back to them, whether it's equity or access to an actual kind of new form of a clinical therapy that we're developing here. So I want to really, really dial it in and focus on those things, because it is quite complex, and we're trying our hardest to really meet the demands of the local complexity of each community, which it is a microcosm upon a microcosm, if you can imagine. And then there's short-term benefit sharing and there's long-term benefit sharing, right? We want to get to the point where we have these longer-term ambitions. And for me, as one of the thinkers, you know, behind this at Variant Bio, and one of the people that wanted to roll this out so passionately and so badly so we can make every other big pharma company on planet Earth look like shit, which is what we're doing. And it was, many Indigenous people are not well because they've been separated from their land. If we step away from that idea of human exceptionalism, it's like you cannot, you know, it's hard for our people in Hawaii to celebrate our culture, hula, our language, our history, our fishing practices, you know, anything, if we are not in control of our primary asset, which is our ancestor, our land, which shaped our genome in the first place. So how do we get back into that pole position where we're able to hold on to and increase cultural revitalization? Well, capitalism happens to be the operating system. We all participate in it. And buying back our land through these mechanisms works, or finding new ways to have custodianship of that land. And all of these other kind of features are involved in that, right? Like water access, clean water. That's a basic human right. Basic human right. But in a place like Hawaii, we have people like Mark Zuckerberg, for example, owns 2,000 plus acres, and he wants to roll out, I don't know, new ranching projects, which is just stupid. Meanwhile, Native Hawaiian people are living under tents in public parks because we can't afford to, own homes. So how do we bring these financial feedback loops, these circular feedback loops, so we can buy back the exact same land that was stolen from? That was, for me, when we were thinking about deploying benefit sharing, that is the North Star, that is the guiding star. Now, historically, there have been some really awesome examples of this. And I just want to take you on kind of a time travel. In the 1990s, it must have been 1998. There was a series of controversies that happened with the Human Genome Diversity Project. So at one point, Stanford is collecting this atlas of genetic information from indigenous people all around the world. And various communities are upset and, raising concerns about this in 110 different directions. At that same time, there's a paper that was published in Nature, and it involved a number of people, and it was a gastric cancer paper where they discovered a new gene. They discovered new mutations in that gene. That gene could later be used to predict and prevent and early stage diagnostics for gastric cancer. And the thing that stuck out to me the most was this was a community that went to the University of Otago and said, a Maori community, and they said, we think that gastric disease is inherited. We want to move forward with this project. Okay, not incentivize. Look, there are people in South Africa named Sarah Tishkoff, let's say names, that have been rolling out large-scale projects, incentivizing people to participate with basic resources like rice. I mean, that's deplorable. We would never do that in 2024 and into the future. I think it's important to call those people's names. But in 1998, we have a whole different paradigm. We have people coming from a community saying we want help. Then they discover a gene, they publish it in the highest quality journal, and they include 2 of the orderlies who were Maori in the author list. Now, at the time, that was like unprecedented. Now that should be the status quo, but that is also a form of benefit sharing. And I feel like there are these historic examples that are peppered in here in the history of population genetics that give us some kind of form of hope,
Thank you, Keola. Inequality in genomics actually comes in many different guises, and we talk about health inequality, but actually we spend quite a bit of time as part of the PPP program talking about some of these inequalities when it comes to research practices, or who gets named as an author, or how many people you have to have in your cohort to get published, and so on and so forth. And I think that as I was sort of explaining earlier, having a conversation, which is what we try to have, about the impacts of genomics with respect to health inequalities, this is not a new point. It's just the latest incarnation of a very old problem. But actually, as part of our discussions, I kind of just refuse to believe that in 2024, just because something is how it's always happened is acceptable. That's kind of a quite fundamental point which we discuss in our roundtables. Anyway, thank you, Keola. I think you've raised some really, really important points there. So we're going to go and have a look really into some of the questions that have been raised. Just a easy one, because I'm not sure that there is an answer or there isn't. But Andre, I think, have you already answered Vicky's question, which is about how did we pick 4%?
Yeah, I actually noticed I answered it privately, but I can talk about it broadly. So I think
this do that, because we get quite a few questions as to, well, 4%, is that the right number, the wrong number? My point is that it's a number. It's a starting point. I don't think anyone is suggesting that this is the only way in the whole world. But if you could just pick up on that, then I'm going to just pick up a couple of other questions. But Andre, if we could go to you, thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this was determined earlier at Variant Bio, also leveraging the experience from some of our founders, our advisors, and some of our executives that have experience with these types of frameworks, including from organizations like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. So really thinking through how do we incorporate that into every research collaboration that we have. And in fact, in the short term, the percentage is higher, is 10% of the study budget is dedicated to short-term benefit sharing. It's kept at $100,000. But then if you think of 4% in the long term, in the event that Variant Bio gets a therapy approved and the revenue that is generated from that, or even 4% equity, right, in the event that we get acquired or we IPO, that's a considerable amount of funding that can go back to our partner communities. So we feel like this is again something that was thought throughout and determined through these early consultations.
Thank you, Andre. I mean, Valerie, Keolu, June, did you actually have anything that you wanted to contribute to that point, or shall we go on to another one? Because I can pick another. Okay, we'll go to another question. This actually was not in the chat. This was raised in advance, but I actually thought this is quite an interesting point. And Valerie, I'd be interested in your thoughts on this. So Professor Sandra Lee at Columbia has asked, how do you, not you personally, how does one assess whether and how an impact on equitable access has been made? And I was quite interested in that because, again, it comes to this point of what is it that we're doing? How do we measure? Vicky has raised some sort of similar points in the chat. How are we measuring impact here? Do you have any thoughts on that question that you'd like to share with us, Valerie? And maybe Keolu?
Well, I think the biggest thing is to try to measure something. So I think one has to measure. And I think there are some very obvious things, you know, a community was or was not involved before. And now let's see if more of those types of communities are involved now. It was mentioned as well whether or not local researchers are actually included as first authors, last authors, somewhere on the paper. That can easily be tracked. I think one can always go back, and I think one should have, you know, we have all the clinical trials should be tracked. Genomic studies should be tracked. A lot of them are tracked in sort of registries. And then one should go back and try to understand what was the impact of the trial itself, and then try to understand, has the impact actually benefited the community? And I think what's very critical, and I think Keolu mentioned that as well, is just that, you know, if there's a therapy that comes out of it, these people need to have access, because you can't just research things on one community and then make sure that people who can afford things have access. So I think there's quite a lot that one can measure. I think it's not going to be just one size fits all. I think, you know, it's going to depend on what obviously the study is, but I would also try to understand, has a research project left something, you know, concretely positive behind? Is something else better? Are there more staff in the clinic? Are they better trained in the clinic? Are more people coming, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? Are outcomes different? So I think there should be some sort of integration also within the health system, because I feel like a lot of these types of studies should be to some degree integrated. I don't think they should all be silos. The health system should at least know that things are happening. So my feeling is there's a lot that one can measure if one puts one's mind to it. And I think one needs to obviously measure at baseline and then throughout the study, possibly not wait, because at times during a study, one realizes that one might have caused some harm from an ethical perspective that one didn't anticipate. So one has to be willing to redirect course during the study and not only think, well, let's tough this out, let's get to the end, and then let's see what happens. So I do feel that this kind of monitoring and evaluation, including about equity questions, should be ongoing throughout the study.
Thank you, Valerie. I'm sure everyone would agree entirely with that. And June, I'm going to come to you, because I think that the point that comes up here, which is this concept of being intentional from the outset, not trying to retrofit something after the end of gone, oh, well, we should have done that, which we didn't. But I think that, you know, that point that you make, Valerie, about ongoing evaluation is very important and persuasive. June, I'm going to invite you for your thoughts, and then let's just see.
Thanks. I wanted to respond in part to this, but also to some of Vicky's points. I think you can structure it to have as much representation and try to mitigate misinterpretation in lots of different ways. So for example, at the study site, the policy is that we employ people from the community and everything is done in the community's first language. So for example, at a meeting, I'm not running the meeting. I'm in the background. when I'm present, because a lot of the time I'm asked not to be there so that the community can have their say, and the team that are engaged in the community can have a robust discussion without any sense of there's this person here who might be representing variant bio or representing the study agenda. So I think there's ways that you can structure how you do the community engagements. There are monthly meetings with what's called a community advisory board, where we do get feedback if people are unhappy or there are aspects that we haven't thought about that come up. And again, I think I am kind of invited to step into the space when the team feel that it's necessary, but for the rest of the time, I'm not in the space. And it's the same with variant bio. There are times when variant bio are asked to be on the call and the meeting to give an input or for something to be discussed, but they are not integral members of the whole process. And then I think there are also tiers at which the engagement happens. So there's the highest level, which is the tribal council, then there's the community representatives, and then there's engagement within the communities, and all of that happens on an ongoing basis. 3 monthly, it's in the communities, monthly, it's community advisory board. So I think if you are thoughtful around it, you can try and mitigate what Vicky's saying about is anything lost in translation, for example, because obviously it can happen. And then I think to Valerie's point around strengthening the health system. So the first project was around water. And I think this also raises the point in terms of the importance of the multi-omics overlay, because a lot of communities have huge environmental factors that are influencing their disease process that are not studied, and they are context specific. So for example, in this community, water is a huge issue. Food security is a huge issue. Premature delivery, pregnancy-induced hypertension in women, kidney disease that gets missed during pregnancy. These are all things, teenage pregnancies, preterm deliveries, these are all things that impact kidney disease further down the line. And this does not apply in a high income setting, for example. And the only way we're going to work that out is if we're looking at gene expression and things like methylation. So it's not just about the genomics, which is why I do think multi-omics overlays in these settings are very, very important for us to understand what's going on. To Valerie's point, and I'll stop after that, but it is very interesting that we had the first project is water, the second was schools, and there was a whole debate on how we do whatever happened in the schools. And what's interesting is the feedback we've now got is the nurses in the clinics are all going, well, what about us? What about the health system? And how are you going to look at that? So it is really interesting to see who comes into the space to voice where they see the gaps. And the other thing is about deciding what you do, because there's so much need. Is it health systems that you capacitate? Is it access to care for people with renal disease? Because in this community, people don't have access to, for example, dialysis and transplantation. Is it about trying to create referral systems to ensure that people get into a care system? Is it about schools? Is it about orphans? Is it about, so I think that's also quite a hard thing to stretch the investment because there is so much need. So I think all of these things are just very real issues that we need to work out. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you, June. I mean, look, I think you and Valerie both very clearly articulated the sort of scale of the challenge. I want to come back to this point that Valerie raised at the beginning, which is how do you choose which communities, are involved? So I don't know, Andre, Keolu, could one of you speak to that point? Because as with everything, you have a finite amount of resources, right? So you can't be in every community in the world. So what is the process for choosing at Variant Bio where you which communities you choose to work with? Would anyone like to answer that question?
I can just answer briefly in terms of our own process internally, but you actually answered it in part already, Kate. So again, we're a small drug discovery biotech focused on genomic research out of Seattle. So we have finite resources to conduct research. So we basically use a kind of like a criteria with 3 key points. We tend to focus on, again, populations that are underrepresented in genomic research, also populations of unique or a particular genetic architecture, because again, that allows us to work with smaller cohorts and conduct deep phenotyping, generate this multi-omic data sets as well. And then populations where there's some level of evidence of unique medically relevant traits, right? So a population that, despite environmental conditions that have like a higher prevalence of kidney disease when it shouldn't, or protection or adaptation processes that have played out, evolutionarily, that despite, again, environmental conditions, they shouldn't have a specific disease, but that's higher or lower due to some of these evolutionary factors.
Thank you, Andre. I mean, I think that you
I think
raised, so Kyola, the on that point though about the fact that you've got a finite resources, Kyola, I want to come to you now, because
Sure.
I wonder whether in some respects, the nature of Variant Bio's business, the fact that you're not this huge corporate, does this enable you to be more nimble in terms of your, what would you, what are your thoughts on that?
I think that's a great question. I kind of want to link a number of things that everyone has said and bring it back to Professor Lee's question from Columbia University when we're talking about evaluating equity. It's so important that we do this empirically, right? But it's one thing is for certain, our, Variant Bio is the David in this scenario, and the Regenerons and the Vertexes are the Goliaths. And one standard of progress, and why this startup is such an experiment itself, is, can the success of benefit sharing, which hearing about all of these different things, and these are good problems to have, right? What do the communities want? Where do the assets go? How do we build out indigenous data sovereignty capacity? How do you put people in positions of control over their gene? I mean, these are major questions. But it is very clear that a company as small as ours is putting major pressure on Goliath companies like Regeneron and Vertex, who are $120 billion plus entities. And they're scared in their boots because they know they need to start doing the right thing, which is parting with portions of their profit and giving that directly back to the individuals who have enabled them to become such large companies. And that's something I'm extremely proud of. So that shows you the power of what we're talking about here. And we'll see. It's an experiment. But I'll tell you one thing for certain. In conversations with folks at 23andMe, they had multiple opportunities to be involved in benefit sharing. This is before they started circling the drain. This is before people intentionally hacked their assets because they were parting with those assets without people's consent. And I think you have to look at the writing on the wall. It's a shame, but they probably should have installed some type of benefit sharing program within their ranks there.
Well, indeed. Okay, so I think that we've got 5-6 minutes left. To me, when I think, if we come back to the premise of the question, which is increasing genetic diversity in drug discovery, this to me comes back to the central point around all of our discussions at PVP around genomics, which is, how do we make the benefits of genomics, which unquestionably, I think everyone on this call understands the potential for significant healthcare benefits to be brought through the lens of genomics. How do we make that equitably available to everybody so that it doesn't just become the preserve of jurisdictions or organizations that can afford to fund it? So that's my exam question. Which one of you lovely people would like to have a go in terms of answering that? And we've only got 5 minutes left, so I'm conscious that we've kind of this is the big question. But I think, to me, all of our discussions, this has to be at the heart of it. is it to sort of, articulate what variant bio are doing and bring that more broadly? But, all of you have your own experiences. But who would like to go first? I'm not going to give up.
I can
Okay,
go.
Keolu, you're so on, Valerie. Thank you.
Just very briefly, I think one of the things would be to improve health literacy. Because I think if people themselves understand the value, they might also then step forward and call for it. So I think maybe at schools, I don't know exactly where, but just improve in general health literacy amongst the population about these potential tools. And then maybe the voice will come more strongly from the ground. I'll leave to others.
Good point about that whole kind of, empowering people to understand the benefits, not having it forced upon them. We can't make people participate in genomics research if they don't want to, but actually having that ability to empower people to make their own decisions. Vicky raised an important point that we'll pick, which is about policymakers, but Keolu.
Oh, I just wanted to add that I think like another true important development is actually building out the capacity in the laboratory setting. So that means we're outsourcing a lot of people's biological material in order to sequence it and store it. And there are other protocol on the back end in terms of what you do with the product, the biospecimen afterwards. But I think the more important position and place we need to go is, are you building people genomic laboratories? Are you building people data centers? Are you building communities, these assets for research so they can prioritize and answer their own research questions? And that seems to be the next leap in growth and capacity building that we're working on. And that's true indigenous data sovereignty, not this BS where we store it on Amazon Web Services. Come on, let's get out of here.
Other cloud providers are available. Okay, so on that, I don't think we never have a problem of shortage of data, right? So one of my big issues is when we talk about data diversity, we're talking like stamp collecting, which is let's just get more data, but it's pointless having the data if we don't do anything with it. So I have my own thoughts on that. June, did you want to share your thoughts? We've only got a few minutes left.
Yeah, I think if we're talking about capacity, it's at multiple levels. I think, for example, with variant bio, the question is, where do we host the data? Because they have the data, but they share the data with us. And what is the platform for that? And we don't have a lot of capacity for that. So I think the capacity building aspect can be focused at multiple levels. I think we also need to be careful how that gets diverted and how that gets approached. Capacity in terms of genomics for us would mean that we would be able to have access to the data and to be able to run our own analyses on the data and to make them openly available and accessible, to capacitate our own scientists to do that. So for example, with the one project with variant bio, we did fund staff members in postgraduate degrees, for example. We support our teams to pursue studies, doctoral masters, for example. So I think there are ways to do this that are multi-level, that have enormous benefit. But I think there needs to be a commitment and an awareness to work out how to do that and to, again, do it up front. I think with genomics, we have loads of gaps. For example, in South Africa, we don't do single-cell RNA sequencing. We don't do metabolomics kind of portfolios. So this is where the equity with variant bio is helpful, because all of that data does get shared with us and we can do with that what we want for our research. So I can nest PhD students in those data kind of sets. We can begin to answer questions that we want to answer that have got nothing to do with variant bio. So I think there are ways to maximize the benefit if we think smartly. Often there's a fight about who has access to what and how and where, and I think that hasn't been the case. And I think that's also a model for the equity component. So I think there's lots of ways to think this through that can be done differently.
And I think
I don't know if that's helpful.
No, absolutely. I mean, I think, to be honest, one of the things I find helpful is having conversations like this, where there's the ability to sort of hear these different perspectives and for people to exchange their insights and to exchange different ways of working. So I thank everyone who's joined us today. Andre, on the basis that we're hosting this together, would you like to kind of share your final thoughts? Because we're just about at time.
No, just wanted to appreciate everyone's participation and engagement, and also to say that, like, you know, we don't believe that Variant Bio has the perfect model or framework for you know, ethical genomic research. It's a constantly evolving and learning process, and we don't wish to be the sole flag bearer of this type of ethical approach. So it's a constant conversation, working with different stakeholders, and continue to learn from this process.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, everybody. So we're a little bit over time, but I just wanted to say thank you all so much for sharing your time with us today. And hopefully you'll join us. We will be starting our Global Genomics program for 2025 in the new year. And we have our in-person event in London on the 20th of November. So if any of you happen to be in London, you'd all be extremely welcome. But all that remains for now is to say thank you so much. Thank you very much for your contributions, and we hope to see you very soon.